Hey, we're continuing with exploring the texturing. In the first video, we explored the UV coordinates. In this lesson, we need to bring up a texture into the fragment shader. This will include a few things that we somewhat already explored in the course. A texture in the fragment shader is similar to the uniform buffers. It is a uniform value, but the texture itself is not accessible directly. You need to access a texture through something called a sampler. The sampler is responsible for reading a texture coordinate, and it can have quite a few settings on how to do that. So in total, we will need to do in the next few videos is create a new uniform descriptor pool and set for the texture, read the image and write it into a buffer memory on the GPU, create image and image view, which will be used create a sampler with its settings, bind the texture for our draw commands, and modify the fragment shader to sample the texture. So in this video, we will start with a descriptor set. Since it is very similar to the descriptor set we did for the uniform buffer, I'll start by going into the fragment shader, and here we will create a new layout that we will bind to the first binding of our second set. It will be the layout of the new uniform sampler 2D. We can build and run to test that there are no errors with building this fragment shader. Next, we need to create the descriptor set info for this set. I go to the header file and I rename the descriptor set layout to uniform set layout. We would also rename this to uniform pool and this to uniform set. And I will copy these two to the bottom, where I will name them accordingly to the texture set layout and texture pool. At the top, I will now rename these functions to create descriptor pools, create descriptor set layouts, and create descriptor sets. I'll take my time now to refactor these new names inside the CVP file, and I will not include it in the video so that I do not waste your time. Now, going into the create descriptor set layouts, and I realize that this function is in the wrong region, so I cut it from the drawing region and I will move it into the buffers region. And inside here, I will now refactor this layout info into uniform layout info. I'll move this code directly into the if check here, and I'll copy this whole section of code. We will rename the binding variable to texture layout binding. And the descriptor type to be changed to a combined image sampler. The stage will now be the fragment shader bit. The layout info also has to be renamed to texture layout info. Its binding is now the texture layout binding. And finally, we can pass it here in the create descriptor set layout, and also change the field address to correspond to the texture set layout. We need to do similar changes here to the descriptor pool. We set the pool size variable name to uniform pool size. We set the create info to uniform pool info. We move the function call directly into the if check, and we duplicate the whole section. We can now rename the pool size to texture pool size, and the type again would be combined image sampler. We pass that onto the pool info object after that, and we rename the uniform pool info into texture pool info. Now from this pool we might allocate more image samplers for more textures. We actually have a limit on how many textures we might have allocated in a descriptor pool. And we can get this from the device properties of the physical device. So I set the descriptor count and the max set to the properties limits max descriptor set samplers. Finally, here in the create descriptor pool, we can pass the texture pool info and the texture pool field. I'll set the debugger now to show you something, and I run the project. It breaks here, and we can explore what are the actual limits for descriptors on the machine. It can be different on yours, and you can explore various other limits as well. I realize that I have made a mistake though, and our limit is not the max descriptor set samplers, since that's an infinite value, but the lower value of max sampler allocation count, which is around 4000. Now when I think about it, let's just put some constant value here, and maybe I will actually keep it in the lower side and just set it to 1024. If I build and run this now, I shouldn't get any mistakes. And now we have the texture layout and descriptor pool ready.